So I did just finish ranking the weapons across all of the base game weapon categories, and there were a handful of weapons that I did consider to be underrated, and there were plenty of people that might be surprised that certain types of weapons got as high as they did. So for today, I'm just going to take a handful of those weapons I talked about and just make a build around them. It's not necessarily going to be like the 5 most broken builds in the game. I have plenty of build videos if you want to check those out, covering a bunch of different types of broken weapons. But for these 5 builds, they're going to be incredibly underrated, really good, and also fun to use as well. Now, before we do get started, I want to touch on this fashion contest that I am going to be hosting just for Halloween. I am going to live stream an event where I just summon a bunch of viewers and you guys can just show off all your different types of fashion. And the people are going to be voting for it as well. I'll probably end up doing it like a day or 2 after Halloween. So if this does interest you, definitely do join the Discord. I'll just link it down below and there will be more information there. But with that out of the way, let's get started. The Golem Fist has gotten a lot better over the previous few patches, and it's to the point that it's one of the best fist weapons in the entire game. It does actually get the most damage in class, however it does actually weigh the most and it does have the highest requirements. But the thing that makes this weapon so amazing is going to be its heavy attack, as it does serve as a projectile. Now this projectile doesn't really do the most amazing damage, does only do about 15 stance damage at a further distance, but at point blank range it is just incredible, as it does have a hitbox with the weapon directly, so you're just doing so much damage, doing about 31 stance damage. And with a bleed infusion, which is what we have this paired alongside with, it can do like over 300 bleed build-up, which is like just as much as like a Blood Fiend's arm charged heavy attack with a bleed infusion. So yes, this is basically what we are going to build around. Now with a bleed infusion, it actually still retains a B scaling and strength, so we are going to go mainly into strength. And once you reach around 60 strength, you're probably better off putting your points into arcane. We are going to have this infused with Shriek of Sorrow. Unfortunately, this is the only weapon buff that you actually can put alongside these projectile types of weapons. So if you are wondering why I'm not infusing this with Craigblade, it's because you can't. Now, as of one of the recent patches, it actually now does work with things like the Axe Talisman and the Spiked tier, as well as the Smithing Talisman. These things are going to help improve the damage by so much more. We're also all going to have the Lord of Blood Exaltation Talisman and the White Mask to just get more damage after proccing bleed at a close distance. And we do also have the Rotten Winged Sword Insignia and the Thorny Cracked tier to just give us more damage with successive attacks. Now, do keep in mind that the projectile portion doesn't actually proc the multi-hit talismans. It's only when you're at point blank range. So the Rotten Winged Sword Insignia can be replaced with something else like a damage negation tier or even the Green Turtle Talisman, because the major downside of this heavy attack, if you haven't noticed already, is going to be its stamina consumption. It consumes like so much stamina, and in just like 2 charged heavy attacks, your entire bar is just gone. Like I have roughly 33 endurance with this build, and it still feels like I need a little bit more. Now, being that we are going to go into a strength build, we might as well utilize some spells with the Claw Mark seal, because with this seal, we actually can retain some pretty decent damage. Now, we're not going to really be using much because the entire build is centering around the heavy attack, which does serve as a projectile anyway, but I always recommend using things like Pest Threads against those really large bosses, because it can mess them up really quickly. And being that we do have a little bit of arcane, might as well just slap on Dragon Eyes, so you can just use it at the beginning of the boss fight and proc Frost, which is going to debuff enemies to make them take more damage. And with that 15 faith that we have spec'd into, obviously Flame Grammy Strength, could use Bestial Vitality too, and we are going to have a dagger in the offhand infused with the Golden Vow. But yeah, the entire gameplay loop is potentially just like leading off the fight with Dragon Ice, maybe throwing a couple of light attacks out there first to just proc the multi-hit talismans, and then start to use your heavy attacks. And you'll just notice that everything is going to get destroyed extremely quickly. The Beast Claw Great Hammer is obviously a great hammer, does scale best off strength, but it still actually does retain a pretty decent dexterity and faith-based scaling. So being that it does have good scalings in 3 different stats, at really high levels, you might notice that it actually does have some pretty decent damage. Does actually get a little bit of split holy damage, so maybe in the base game, you might be noticing that it's lacking a little bit. But this weapon is still good for multiple different reasons. One is going to be its heavy attack. Compared to all the other great hammers, it just gets the highest amount of motion values in terms of its heavy attack, so it just hits the hardest. And with the Great Hammer heavy attacks, they get some of the highest stance damage as well. Like 43 stance damage with 1 charged heavy attack, and is paired with really good damage. It's going to be something worth building around. Hence having things like the 2-handed talisman, the Axe Talisman, Spiked tier, and the Blade of Mercy. Now yes, the Blade of Mercy and 2-handed talisman is from the DLC, so if you were to use this thing in the base game, an early game alternative could be something like damage negation talismans, or maybe even the Flox Canvas Talisman for spells, or the Carrion Filigid Crest to decrease the FP consumption of the skill, because the skill is actually going to be another amazing part of the weapon. Regal Beast Claw for 20 FP fires out this amazing AoE attack that goes on a nice horizontal spread, does really good damage, and goes relatively far. The casting animation might not be the quickest thing, but just being able to hit multiple enemies at once or hitting enemies that like to move and dodge around, this thing is honestly really good for that. Now, being that we do have somewhat of a strength faith based build, once again we're going to have the Claw Mark seal and just use a little bit of spells. We have 26 faith, so having things like Golden Vow and Pest Thread Spears are just going to be must-haves. Now, if you haven't gone to the DLC, just using regular pest threads is still going to suffice. And we do also have Catch Flame if you do fight those enemies that are weaker to fire damage. And we do have the entire Rakshasa set equipped as well because it's like a bunch more damage. But yes, basically how I like to use this build is that I'll trade out with charged heavy attacks. And if I do have like a longer opening or if I'm fighting multiple enemies or enemies at a distance, then I would just use a skill. But yeah, honestly, it doesn't really matter how you use it. It's still going to be an amazing weapon. The Rose's Axe ranked in the top 3 in my axe ranking list, which actually did surprise a lot of people, but it did make it to the top 3 for a very good reason, as it is going to have the most range compared to all the other axes and get really good damage too. This weapon gets a really good strength and intelligence based scaling, and axes over time have only just gotten better. Like these actually perform as some of like the best two-handed DPS options, so just straight up R1 spamming with this weapon is actually very viable. But thankfully it actually does have a very good skill as well in Rose's summons. For only 15 FP, it summons out a bunch of these skeletons that all just like swing at once and actually do pretty decent damage. It can stun lock smaller enemies, and it can also do some pretty decent stance damage as well. The skill doesn't actually have any hype armor, but even if you do get interrupted out of it, the skeletons are still guaranteed to come out. And they have pretty decent hitboxes too. They're not going to have any tracking by any means, so it might not be the easiest thing to use, and it might not be as good as DPS as just like straight up R1 spamming, but in terms of the stun lock potential, its burst DPS, this thing is honestly really good. In terms of the talismans, obviously going to have the Shard of Alexander. I do have the two-handed talisman for just more damage with like the entire moveset, and I am also going to have the Rotted Wing Sword insignia because the axe moveset is actually pretty quick. I do also have a damage negation talisman, close range skill, so you might get hit a whole bunch in the meantime. Now, if you are confident that you're not going to be getting hit as much, you could replace this with like the Graven Mass Talisman, because obviously with our intelligence build, might as well utilize some spells. We don't have like the highest amount of intelligence because this weapon does scale better off strength, but there are going to be some things that are very handy. Zamor Ice Storm is probably going to be like the most important one on this list because this build just procs Frost basically instantly. Every single intelligence build, I just recommend using this. Just lead off the boss fight with it. It's going to do decent damage, do really good stance damage, and after proccing Frost, enemies get debuffed for the next 20 seconds. I also like to use Shard Spiral against really large bosses because this spell actually hits multiple times and you can just keep spamming it over and over again for not much FP. It's basically the Pest Threads equivalent for the sorceries, and you can also just have like any random projectile option. I just have Glintstone Nails. You could have anything in this slot as long as you just have a projectile option to just hit enemies at a further distance. And then obviously Terra Magica, if you do get in those instances to where you can use it and just utilize the entire spells that you have, it's not going to boost the damage of the weapon that much because the skeletons mainly actually do physical damage, but it still is pretty handy to have. And in terms of the crystal tier, we just have the intelligence and magic boosting tier. This does get more damage out of our weapons and the spells too. The Vulgar Militiasaur is a halberd that doesn't really get the most range nor the most damage by any means, but it does have a few specific uses for it that actually make me consider it to be underrated. And one is going to be its synergy with an arcane or an occult infusion. This thing actually gets a really good arcane scaling, and at higher levels it can get respectable damage. And obviously being that it has passive bleed, going with an occult infusion and all into the arcane stats is just going to give it a whole bunch of bleed build up too. I probably consider it to be like the best bleed polearm option with an occult infusion because it can get like just as much damage as like the Grave Scythe, but just get more bleed build up and also have better weapon skill options. The mage one being Spectral Lance, which is going to be what we build around today. This weapon skill for only 9 FP goes incredibly far, does decent damage, but most importantly, does really good stance damage. Now, the stance damage of this skill is dependent on which weapon that you actually have. So if you pair it alongside a Great Spear, it's going to get really good stance damage. If you pair it alongside a regular spear, not going to be as much. But even with something like a halberd, it does still do 25 stance damage. And if you manage to hit a headshot, it's going to be even more stance damage, which is actually very possible because the skill does get a bit of tracking. And just being able to do 25 stance damage at this far of a distance is honestly kind of broken. Now, to build around it, obviously we're just going to go into a pure arcane build. We're going to have the Shard of Alexander, and we are also going to have the Arrow Reach Talisman because this skill actually does get a whole bunch of damage fall off. But with this talisman, it means you can do a lot more damage at these further distances, and the skill can actually go a lot further as well. It can turn into one of the best sniping options in the entire game just by having this talisman equipped. It also does get boosted by the Smithing Talisman, but that is only a 10% damage increase, and I feel like I'm going to get better use out of the other talismans that I do have, such as the Lord of Blood Exaltation. Every single time that you proc bleed, you're going to get roughly 20% damage for the next 20 seconds, and this does stack with the White Mask that does the exact same thing, but only a 10% damage increase. And I am also going to have the Blade of Mercy, because with how fast this thing actually is at proccing stance breaks, we're just going to benefit a lot off this talisman. Every time you actually go for a critical attack, you're also going to get 20% damage for the next 20 seconds. And we can pair this alongside other different types of spells to help stance break even quicker. Because yes, going into an arcane build, I always recommend going into a little bit of faith and using the Dragon Communion Seal so you can benefit off a whole bunch of really good incantations. I have things like Catch Flame just to have as like a fire-based option. Dragon Ice is like my favorite breath incantation. as it is really cheap, low requirements, and procs Frost basically just as fast as like Borealis' Mist. So I just like to lead off the boss fight with this proc Frost instantly. And I also am going to have Dragon Maw. Now Dragon Maw does have a 23 faith requirement, but I do have the faith tier equipped to help me meet the requirements of this spell. And Dragon Maw is like a close range spell that does like ridiculous amounts of stance damage. So when enemies like get closer to you after you've done using Spectral Lance, you could just like finish him off with this spell, instantly proc a stance break, get to your riposte, proc things like the Blade of Mercy. Also have things like Pest Threads for larger bosses, and the obvious Golden Vow Flame Get Me Strength spells. And in terms of the last crystal tier slot, I just went with the Opaline tier. There wasn't really anything that I could use to boost the damage reliably. You could go the Blood Sucking tier if you wanted to, but that actually does drain your health by a whole bunch, so it might be a little bit too risky. But yeah, if you haven't used a Spectral Lance build, I definitely recommend giving this one a shot. The Erdsteel Dagger is the highest damaging dagger in the game, and it also does get the best movesets too. So if you actually wanted to go with a dagger build and have daggers be a primary option, this is going to be better than all the other daggers. Now I still don't really consider daggers to be better than things like curved swords or straight swords, as those aren't that much slower, but they just do way more damage, respectable stance damage, and just have good stagger potential. But the Erdsteel Dagger is a very special exception for a few different reasons. One, it actually does come with a split faith-based scaling and actually have the ability to be infused. So when you actually pair this alongside a faith-based infusion, whether it be Sacred or Flame Art, when you level up Faith, it actually boosts the physical damage as well. Normally with these infusions, they only boost just the fire damage or holy damage, but for this weapon, which is most likely going to be a bug, does actually boost the physical damage. But this weapon has always worked like this since the beginning of the game, and they haven't changed it, and they most likely never will. Now the next best thing about the weapon is going to be its heavy attack, as it does result in this amazing like double swiping attack, which as of one of the recent patches, it actually has gotten faster in terms of the uncharged heavy. And with this weapon, I would just never use light attacks at all. You only either use charged heavy attacks or uncharged heavy attacks, mainly being the uncharged heavy attacks, because they come out really fast. They're gonna proc the multi-hit talismans really quickly, hence us having like basically all the items equipped, and we're just gonna be using skills that just boost the damage. For the most part, we're just gonna be using it with a Flame Art infusion and pairing it alongside Flame Spear. Now, if you haven't gone to the DLC, Flaming Strike is going to be a good alternative, but the reason why we use Flame Spear is because that one actually scales off Faith, where Flaming Strike scales off Strength, and Flame Spear actually does boost it with more damage as well, and it is a quicker buffing animation. Now, the benefits of Faith builds and using infusible weapons is that you can go back and forth between Fire and Holy, so when you are fighting enemies specifically in the DLC that tend to be weaker to Holy damage, you can just slap on a Sacred Infusion with Sacred Blade, and also does benefit of amazing damage. Now, in terms of the talismans, as I mentioned, we have the multi-hit talismans. We are going to have the two-handed talisman because we're just going to have this two-handed the entire time, and that's just 15% damage to all of our attacks except for critical attacks and the skill damage. And we do also have the Godfrey's icon, which is 15% more damage when we have our skills and spells fully charged. Now, if you don't really care to use spells, you could just go with the Shard of Alexander here, but being that we do have 80 faith, we're going to slap on the Erdtree Seal and just use a whole bunch of really good spells. Knight's Lightning Spear is like one of the best single target options. Pest Thread Spears is amazing for larger bosses, and Rotten Butterflies just procs Scarlet Rot incredibly quickly, and it's 30% rot damage. Now, these are obviously DLC spells, but the alternatives for these are going to be like regular Lightning Spear, regular Pest Threads, and Scarlet Aeonia. Also, just want to have an AoE option. I just went with Bone O Flame. You could just use anything here, as long as you just have something for an AoE to hit multiple enemies if you do get grouped up. Obviously, Golden Vow, Flame Get Me Strength, and you want to have a healing option. At higher levels of Faith, you're going to benefit of so much more heals. I went with Heal from Afar because this one actually does have the fastest animation and not really consume much FP, but like literally any healing spell is going to do perfectly fine. So just go with what you're comfortable with. And in terms of the crystal tiers, obviously as I mentioned, the Thorny Cracks tier, and depending on the infusion will be dependent on your second tier slot. If you have a Flame Art infusion, go with the Fire tier. If you have a Sacred infusion, go with the Holy tier. But yeah, the entire gameplay loop is just spamming heavy attacks, mixing the charged heavy attacks, and if enemies get further away from you, use things like Knight's Lightning Spear. If you're fighting larger bosses, potentially lead off the fight with Rotten Butterflies and just clean them up with Pest Thread Spears. But yeah, if you actually ever wanted to go with a dagger build and didn't want to result in just like skill spamming, I recommend going with this one. Anyway, that is that now done. It actually has been a little bit since I've last made a build video, so if you actually do want to see more, definitely let me know down in the comments. But in terms of what's happening next, I am going to get started on the ranking videos again. Probably going to rank things like the bows and then move on to the DLC weapon categories. But if you guys do want to see some more build videos, I can do some more in between. So definitely do subscribe for that, and also do follow me on Twitch, because I'm live there basically every day doing a bunch of challenge runs or doing some variety streams. And also, if you are interested in the fashion contest stream, go join the Discord to find out some more information. Anyway, catch you guys around. Bye.